Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First of all, I want to extend a word of thanks to the organizers of this symposium, particularly to the Afro-Middle East Center and IPSA for inviting me here. It's always wonderful to be in Cape Town, but particularly wonderful when your weather is so beautiful in May. So thank you all, and inshallah, I hope that at the end of this day, we are in a better place to engage meaningfully, but also honestly with with some of these issues within our communities. So Zahra says I have 20 minutes. I don't think I'm going to take 20 minutes. I think I'm going to take a little less than that. But I want to start off by asking, how many of you bought a newspaper this week? No, any newspaper. How many? All? Okay, how many people have a digital subscription to any news service? Okay, and how many people are prepared to pay for their news? So that right there is the problem that news media around the world is currently confronting. That fewer and fewer people are ready to buy newspapers. And while we are all dedicating efforts to building relevant forms of media online, the digital realm still has not been able to lend itself towards the imperatives of commercial media. So what we have then is also Google and Facebook, who, I'm not sure how many of you know, consume 80% of digital advertising revenue. So this is kind of the impossible place within which media, not just in South Africa, but around the world, are playing in. And it's against this backdrop that journalists in South Africa, but also journalists everywhere in the world, are facing a crisis of relevance. And it's a big statement to make, and I make it advisedly. I make it as a journalist myself. I make it as an editor of an independent news publication. Journalists and journalism is facing a crisis of relevance. And it is deeply, deeply serious. We need to be engaging with what it means. And when it comes to a topic like the one that we're discussing here today, what I seek to put forward is that a lot of the issues that are inherent to journalism itself, not just in South Africa, but around the world, are, come up as symptoms in the way we treat issues like ISIS in a place in South Africa, like South Africa. So I think that's really, really important when we think about the media. And we think about who is the media and how indeed the media is confronting these issues, that we also try to understand what exactly is the media doing and how are they trying to survive. So a few weeks ago I had to referee a huge debate in my newsroom. One half of the newsroom said that they believe that the role of journalists and the Mail and Guardian is to uphold democracy. That is what they're there for. They are there to protect South African democracy. And the other half of the newsroom said, can we not have such delusions of grandeur? We're just here to tell the news. And it may sound like a very nonsensical debate, but you'd understand that confronting these issues about why we do what we do and in the service of what is really, really important, because that informs our approach to stories, not just like this one, but in every other story we do. So it was quite a heated debate, as you'd imagine, and it was also deadline day. So tempers were particularly high. So I tried to referee this, this debate in this way. I said that, of course, our job is to tell the news. And it is to tell the news as truthfully, honestly, and accurately, but also fairly as possible. But we have to believe that the action of telling the news in that way somehow is in the service of a more just and equal society. So for me, the thing is that in a space like the MNG, we can define ourselves like that. We're much smaller, we're independent, and I never hear from my bosses about how exactly I should approach a story. That's not the case in big media houses. And this is really, really important to understand how commercial imperatives inform the news agenda. Not just regarding South African news, but also how South Africa sees the rest of the world and how international news then filters itself into the South African newsroom. It's really important that we understand that. One of my pet peeves as a young journalist, and I don't think I'm a young journalist anymore, was that South African media is so and always looking inside and always, reporting on this person in the ANC sneezed and that one coughed, without actually looking at this whole beautiful world outside of us and trying to understand that actually our problems are not that unique, that there are issues faced by other developing nations that have parallels to us and perhaps even learning. So, this has been sort of one of my passions, that I do feel that media in South Africa need to take a step out and also to be able to position itself within a greater geopolitical context. So the reason that I'm bringing all of this up again is because we need to understand as journalists and as editors how we serve our communities. And more, like I said, there is the sense that the work that we do is in peril. I'm asked nearly at every board meeting that we have, how much longer do I think the MNG will still be printing, the newspaper? The first time I was asked that, I was absolutely taken aback. It's not something that I had ever, thought about actually. But more and more people in media regard this product, regard independent media as in peril. So what does this leave, journalists with and editors? Editors want to be bold, and journalists are constantly trying to break the mold, to tell stories differently or to tell different stories. One of my colleagues had a chat with the Sunday Times the other day, so we're constantly looking at what colleagues elsewhere are doing to, of course, measure ourselves against them, also to feel good about ourselves. And so we'd noticed, the Sunday Times almost, for a couple of weeks now going with non-political leads, which is quite unusual, particularly considering this is a big political year. And we thought this is a conscious strategy, and they said no, it just happened to be that way. But they said what they found is that those were the papers that are selling much more, that are bringing many more people up on the website. So these more and more, it is the awareness of what people want to read that informs as well the news agenda. And it's not ideal, because if we do really allow, the general people and people's browsing or reading habits to inform what we do, we'd be serving up cat videos every day. What remains imperative is that the MNG readers or any reader, viewer, listener of a news media publication, whatever it is, deserves well-researched and substantiated news. We deserve to serve people the kind of news that is researched, that is thought about, that is analyzed, that has gone through the strictest processes among a number of people, so that it can be differentiated from the kind of rumors that are broadcasted on WhatsApp groups every day. Okay? But when it comes to, again, this topic about ISIS or the Islamic State group in South Africa, it has tended towards, reporting that is, has tended towards hysteria, prejudice, and bigotry. And I say this again as a South African journalist. I say this as an editor of a national paper. I say this because we need to be reflective within the media space as well about what we do and how we do it. Because for me, our crisis of relevance does not come alone from the disruption of technology. But I think more and more it also is an opportunity for us to reflect on how we tell stories and how better we can tell them and who are we listening to when we tell these stories. So in the course of thinking about this, about this talk here, I went back, to try to find, is that better? To try to find some of, sort of the earliest reports of ISIS sympathy within South Africa. And I went back to, I think one of the first articles was published by the Sunday Tribune, and I've got to put down the date here. And it was basically that first report about what many of us within our communities were hearing, that two young South Africans had died in combat in territories controlled by the Islamic State group. But looking, and I remember we dissected this piece on the Daily Vox. So for those of you who are interested, you can go back to that. But I think, reading that piece again, but also sort of trying to unpack sort of the trends here early on. What is immediately apparent is how, if we are indeed to promote a culture of credible journalism, how journalism like that fails us. Because credible journalism relies on details, it relies on specifics. Whether we are talking about the Islamic State group, or whether we are talking about the ANC succession race, or whether we are talking about a socio-economic sort of phenomenon, in general, we need specifics. This is how we are able to get readers to trust us. This is how we can differentiate ourselves from your WhatsApp group. So we must be able to be as specific as possible in order, I believe, to persuasively inform our readers, listeners, and viewers to trust us to present a view of the world to them. And yet it says a lot about how the approach to the Islamic State group in South Africa was treated, in that if you look at those early reports, how vague it is on details. So again, this very first report, or the first one that I've pulled out here, relies on just one named source, the former Iraqi ambassador to South Africa, and the rest was a lot of analysis packed in there. So when if we look at that again, one named source in this whole thing, what does this tell us? It tells us that an editor, or let's be frank, the editors, because there's often several people who make these decisions, decided to tell a story that affects an entire community of a few million people in South Africa based on one person's account. The story also went on to say that the Department of State Security said they were not aware of any people who had left South Africa to join the Islamic State. This is again early on. This would change, in latter months. And it also quoted the Syrian embassy, bizarrely, part of a government which is hardly functioning, who also said they were not aware. But while we look at this, the bread and butter of journalism is missing. There are no names of these people who supposedly died there. No dates, no locations. It is as good as that WhatsApp message. And this is when it becomes a bit dangerous for us. So again, my point is that very early on, what you notice is that reports on sympathy for the Islamic State group in South Africa fell into the trap of turning small pockets of sympathy for the IS group into an opportunity to reflect on the Muslim community and issues regarding radicalization and extremism that is currently the fashion around the world. So that, you read this article and suddenly Muslims have to, there's a quote there from the Jamiat and MJC and people, as if they have some kind of insight or should have some kind of, or be able to define themselves as not being that. Which is, again, it has a parallel to what's happening in global media. So, if we look at these stories, it could be broken down like this. An unnamed random man went with his unnamed friend to an unnamed, I'm talking now about, like these stories about radicalization, that, are also part of this report. And it sort of went like this. An unnamed random man went with his unnamed friend to an unnamed mosque in some part of an entire province where he heard a random hateful sermon by some unknown speakers and therefore decided at some unknown time to go to, Syria and Iraq. So it's really important for us as news media professionals to reflect on this. But I think it's also really important for all of you to be able to unpack these, properly. So, and I think it's also in spaces like these that we need to have honest conversations. Do these conversations happen? Let's be very frank, they do. Are there bigots in South Africa? Yes. There are bigots in our mosques, as there are bigots in our temples, as there are bigots in our churches, as there are bigots in Parliament. I think, however, that one of the greatest failings of us in South Africa, as media professionals in South Africa, as part of this global mass media machine, is our collective failure here to be able to unpack what is happening with actual specifics. So this week at the MNG, I received an op-ed from a researcher who I know has been spending a lot of time analyzing issues of radicalization and speaking to people who have sympathies for the IS group. So this person sent this op-ed to me, for consideration for publication. So as I had a look at it, so there were several claims in it. Number one, it starts off by saying, for example, that South Africa is basically the center. I forget the exact terminology that was used, but South Africa is the center for funneling terror-related funds in the whole world. South Africa is the capital for that. So it's, it starts off with this. Anyway, so the point of this piece was to say that there appears to be a change in the tactics of South African recruits to the IS group, in that they're no longer being encouraged to go to IS territories, they're now encouraged to do the work here. So that was basically the ostensible thrust of this piece, which is interesting, and I think you'd all agree, worth publication. But when I looked at what is the basis for this, it was based on 8 interviews over Twitter. So this is a problem as well that journalists face, in that we are dealing with a phenomenon that is so murky, addled by the complications of Twitter, and compounded by our own constraints within the newsroom. This then gives you an idea of the kind of space that we're working with. But I think that, the point that I'm trying to make here is that there certainly has been significant weaknesses in the treatment of particularly IS sympathy within South Africa. But what I'm saying is a lot of it is not unique to the subject, but rather a symptom of greater weaknesses within South African newsrooms. But at the same time, when South African newsrooms have taken up this topic, they've done so in a way that mimics big English-speaking news media around the world, in that it seeks to emphasize the brutalized Westerner instead of actually looking at the reality in that actual Iraqis and Syrians are the greatest victims of the IS group. So that's something I think for us to think about, and inshallah we'll have some time to unpack this a bit later. Thank you.
Yes, I think what Khadija said was very, very useful for us. I think in a nutshell, she said, if you want to enter the most middle that the ambassador spoke about, do not pass on WhatsApp messages, but rather interrogate them. And if you read anything on Twitter or in a newspaper that sounds like that, then ignore it. We welcome Dr.